Welcome everyone to Awesome Truth, a wrestling book club. I'm your host, Steve Semino, and with me as always is my co-host, Walt Schwenk. Hey, Walters.
Hello, Steven. How's it going today?
Little twist again. Well, it's going very, very well because we have a special guest today. We're not going to leave you here too much. We're going to get you to the action as soon as we can because it's friend of the show, probably best friend of the show, Walt, Keith Elliot Greenberg.
Yeah, Keith's back. I believe it's an unprecedented fifth time on the podcast, and he's here. He's been very busy in the last few days. So he allowed us. He gave us some time while he's overseas to interview him about his new book, Follow the Buzzards, Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19. We're obviously really excited to talk about it. And I don't know why we never thought to, ask for an advance copy, but we actually had a chance to read the damn book before it was published. And Keith was kind enough to lend it to us so we could actually have a meaningful conversation.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about this down the line, but like Walt said, we got an advance copy. The book is out now as of this recording, so please go buy it. But we got to read it a little early, and so we did sort of a little preview with Keith, just talking about the book, his, the genesis of it, where it came from, and how he put it together. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Keith Elliot Greenberg. We are so glad to have a special guest on the show today. Our first member of the Five Timers Club, Walt. He's been here 4 times before. He's back again to talk about his book, Follow the Buzzards, Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19. Keith Elliot Greenberg, welcome back to Awesome Truth.
Hey, Steve. Hey, Walt.
Keith, always a pleasure. Usually we do this in person, but you're overseas right now in London, doing
selling
a book
books.
Tour. Yeah, selling books. So
yeah.
Glad to have you here on Zoom.
I think once I got that 2-star review on Amazon, the book sales spiked.
I'm looking at that right now, and I don't want to say anything, but I do see 1 rating.
You know what? Like I was waiting for weeks to get my first review on Amazon. Like I had 6 on Goodreads. And, then the other day I'm in Manchester in the UK and someone says, yeah, you have a review on Amazon. It's 2 stars. And the guy says that that he gave me 2 stars because the book is infused with Trump hate. And, I bounced between real life events and wrestling events because they all merged during COVID. I wouldn't say it was Trump hate. I wasn't making things up. I quoted Trump when he said outrageous things, and I, quoted the Democrats when they did flawed things, but it's not even a book about the US presidential election. But whatever, I knew I was going to get this kind of criticism. One person said on Goodreads I shouldn't have mentioned Brexit. So if, this is a mixture, it's a juxtaposition of what was going on in the real world. If you don't want to read about that stuff, buy something else.
Yeah. The wrestling parts of it are all 5 stars. It's the non-wrestling parts of your wrestling book that people
apparently.
Right. But look, when I wrote a book with superstar Billy Graham, a friend of mine said, I didn't like that there was too much in there about his liver transplant. Some people, when they buy a wrestling book, they only want wrestling in there. And so it's not for everybody, but it's for a lot of people.
I mean, Walt and I have read a million wrestling books, and they all run together to a certain point when they're just about wrestling. So I think a little curveball is on my end very appreciated.
I wasn't trying to give a curveball, but I felt that you could not talk about what was going on, in wrestling without acknowledging what was happening in the rest of the world. I mean, during the COVID era, you had everything else that was happening in the world, including what was going on in politics, because politicians were making decisions that would impact what precautions would be made. And, Brexit was going on. There was a lot of anxiety already in the UK. So I had to mention that. There's a lot in it. It's mainly wrestling, but there's other things, that serve as a backdrop.
Well, it's interesting because, we've only you were kind enough to give us a preview of the book ahead of the release, and so we made it through. I mean, I made it through half of it, and it's great. You mentioned the original conceit of the book was a little different, and then obviously once COVID happened, it was like clearly like, okay, this is where we should be taking our story and this
Yeah,
book.
I mean, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, like, what was truly the original conceit of this book before all this? Like, what was this? There's just like a logical sequel to Too Sweet the Indie Revolution, or
yes, that's what it was going to be, because as you recall, because I know both of you guys read it, since you're both mentioned in it, Too Sweet Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution ends just before the first Dynamite broadcast. And it ends with Marco Stunt, Joey Janela, Jungle Boy, and Orange Cassidy leaving a GCW show. For those who don't know, that's an independent wrestling show, and driving down to Washington, D.C. for the first Dynamite telecast. And so I thought, well, this needs a sequel because it's a cliffhanger. What's going to happen? Will AEW stay in business? Will AEW bite into WWE's ratings? What happens to the indies after this? Do all the indie stars go to AEW? Does WWE grab all the other indie stars? And so I already had signed a contract to do a sequel to Too Sweet. And by the time I was finished writing the epilogue, the COVID had happened. And so now we knew that this was overshadowing everything. And I said, this has to be a book about pro wrestling during COVID.
And Keith, I think, pro wrestling during COVID is a great subject, because Walt and I've talked about it before on the show. It comes up obviously in the way the product has been presented over the last couple of years, but it's really the only thing that I could think of. There might be a few examples, but very, very other few that made it through COVID and tried to keep going. Like they didn't do a months-long pause. They didn't hold off. Like the old Vinceism, the show must go on, really was put to the test here and showed itself to be a reality, because every company just was so focused on we must keep doing wrestling. At least the big ones.
Well, I mean, in the U.S., Canada didn't have any live wrestling shows. Rev Pro wasn't running shows. NXT UK shut down for a good chunk of it, and then they were doing shows from the studio, and in New Japan shut down for several months. But in the US, yes, the pro wrestling appeared on TV fresh every single week, and that was both AEW and WWE. Now, that was aided in part because they happened to do their TV in the state of Florida, which had a governor who deemed pro wrestling, WWE in particular, an essential business. And I do point out that, obviously it's no secret that the McMahon family have contributed quite a bit of money to Republican causes. And this isn't as well known, but Shad Khan, Tony Khan's father, owner of AEW, also contributed more than $1 million to Donald Trump's campaign. And he's the wealthiest person of Pakistani ancestry in the world. And did that help pro wrestling being deemed an essential business? It might have, but it doesn't matter really, because pro wrestling filled a need in people. And was it an essential business? Emotionally, it might have been. So, the guys put themselves in a lot of danger, making sure they were at TV whenever there was a taping. They actually no longer had live TV for a good period. But, the people needed something that felt they were, to help them feel they were getting out of their shell. But it didn't really. But on the other hand, because they were in an empty performance center, because, everybody was anxious about COVID-19, because guys like Roman Reigns took themselves out of WrestleMania, you couldn't fully escape what was going on outside. And that's a lot of what the book is about.
But before we kind of dive deeper into the big companies that were able to sustain like these setbacks and find a way to keep producing TV to make their millions of dollars in TV rights. I mean, I think there's a bit of irony in the fact that like the sequel of the indie revolution in many ways, and you do a great job detailing this in the early chapters of all the companies that had big weekend set for WrestleMania 36 in Tampa, that a lot of them shut their doors and never really opened again. And so I'm curious, like from your take, going from years of getting in with these indie promoters and wrestlers, and then telling the opposite story almost in the second book, in the sequel, where a lot of them might never operate again. I mean, what was that like?
But then some have come back, like House of Hardcore. Tommy Dreamer's group has returned, and Tommy Dreamer explains pretty eloquently he just couldn't afford to run an indie, even in terms of testing everybody. Before there was a vaccine, you'd have to test people to let them wrestle. You know, he didn't have the money, it's an indie, to meet those protocols. You know, so there was no choice. Also, you couldn't get people in a building. House of Hardcore is based in the Northeast, where there were far more stringent restrictions. So where were you going to hold a show? Now, GCW, Game Changer Wrestling, they got around it eventually by staging outdoor shows in the summertime in a park in Indiana during the daytime, where they could spread people out on the lawn and keep groups socially distanced from one another, as did Warrior Wrestling, which is a great group out of Chicago Heights, Illinois. That's run by the principal of Marion High School in Chicago Heights. So he's both the promoter and the principal, and they were able to hold shows on the high school football field, and it was vast. So you could isolate people, but they would be in groups, but there was plenty of space in between them.
Yeah, Keith, I mean, you obviously people did get creative as they had to run shows. Like you said, in the warm weather, they were certainly trying everything to get people out there, because the alternative, you know, especially for the big companies for televised shows, was to perform to no one, to have the wrestlers in the ring and that's it, and have an empty crowd. And you quote some wily veterans in the book talking about how difficult that must be. Like, you know, the crowd is what matters. Like, was that an across the board feeling you got from everybody? Like, that is just one of the hardest things you could possibly do in wrestling?
Because no one was prepared for it. I mean, I quote Tommy Rich talking about how you would read the crowd, and that would determine, you know, basically would determine your game in the ring. It would determine where you were going in the ring. Particularly Tommy Rich, who peaked at a time when, you know, you weren't relying on, oh, the commercial break is coming up, you guys have to speed it up. Yeah, he was on TV, but live was where you made your money back then. And if the fans were getting into it, you gave them more, and you went longer. I mean, Vincent James McMahon, also known as Vince Sr., used to determine the next main event based on how the main event at Madison Square Garden went the month before. And if the fans were really into it, he'd say, okay, these two guys are main eventing again next month, but this time in a Texas death match. So there was a lot of improvisation in the moment. But, you know, it didn't really matter. Like, I interviewed Trey Miguel, who talks about you always play to the fans, and now you had to learn to play to the camera. And some guys use this to watch themselves and watch old-time wrestling to inspire them. They'd watch their own matches to say, what can I do better when this is all over? And they'd watch old-time wrestling to determine, hey, maybe I need to incorporate some of this. But there was a moment, I tell the story in every interview, where I was watching AEW with my daughter, and Lance Archer was in the ring. And at one point, to heal it up, he kicks the barricade, and there's no one there. And she's like, what did he do that for? And, you know, because you don't know. Nobody knew. Yep. And you can't tell someone, don't kick the barricade, until someone kicks the barricade and everyone goes, oh, wow, that didn't work.
Or it's like muscle memory. These guys have been doing this for 20 years,
Right.
and all of a sudden they don't know how. That's just what they do, you know?
Imagine a bad guy in real life would just kick things, generally
Yeah.
speaking. So I mean, maybe
Yeah, they're healed.
Imagine
They're
if
technology's still there.
If Marina Shafir was, in the ring at that time.
It was fun. It was fun just like going through the book and reading your recap of what was going on from week to week. Like I can't remember what happened earlier this year in wrestling, let alone in 2020, but there were so many iconic moments just from cinematic matches and a lot of like experimentation. And then still you had the WWE like battle for in air quotes. You probably won't be able to see that in a podcast, but it was just fun revisiting a lot of that through your lens and just like reliving all those moments.
I forgot it too. If I hadn't, I was keeping a file on different, on both wrestling occurrences and real life occurrences. And so, I didn't, I recently reread parts of the book. And I was like, wow, I forgot about that. And more so, I forgot how things felt. And being in the moment, I was able to write that when I felt it. And I'm not sure if I would remember it with the same vibrance as I did at the time. But it was hard to write a book as things were happening because usually I'm writing in retrospect.
I was gonna say, I remember in real time when we were able to get together and watch wrestling again. I remember you even back then saying like, "Hey, the Thunderdome was actually pretty great and pretty revolutionary." And just seeing, like, I'm up to the point in the book where we're talking about the Thunderdome, and it's just like I remember us talking about these things as they were happening and just like our reaction to it. And you kind of get a lot of that from your retelling and your recounting of all those events.
And now that you mention it, because you and I do get together regularly and watch wrestling, at first we weren't doing that. If you recall, were you part of that house party gathering for WrestleMania 36?
I was not. I don't think I was.
Maybe they didn't invite you. I doubt it.
Oh no!
He certainly invited you. But we were all watching WrestleMania 36 in different places on house party both nights. And I remember the first night I got really drunk. So I didn't remember much of WrestleMania 36. So I kind of rewatched parts the next day. And then the next night I said, I'm just going to, I'm not going to, drink as much because I really want to absorb this, because especially if I'm writing a book about this period, I shouldn't be blacking out on certain matches. But it was weird because we were all talking. We were all talking during WrestleMania 36, but we're watching it in separate places. And because I didn't keep a record of it, I don't remember when was the first time a few of us got together and watched wrestling, as a group of friends, which is such a standard thing now. And was such a standard thing before.
Yeah, and it's like you talked about how was pro wrestling a necessary thing? Like probably not. I don't think we needed pro wrestling, but I do remember those moments you're talking about. Like I remember watching WrestleMania 36. I remember watching the AEW match with the teams on the football field. I forget what they call it.
Yeah, that was good. Stadium Stampede.
Stampede. Thank you. Like these were really like these. There was not a lot going on for obvious reasons. So even though it was not a necessity, and certainly I'm very happy that as far as we know, very few people were significantly harmed by participating in wrestling at that time. But I am retroactively, those do stand out to me as somewhat milestones, and maybe for the lack of just anything else going on. But it was nice.
Stadium Stampede was great.
It was.
And when I was together with a group of my friends here in the UK, it's all wrestling people, all wrestling fans together. And because I've been, going on book tours, and I've been going on book signings here, and I've been doing it in coordination with Inside the Ropes. Inside the Ropes is the British magazine I write for, but Kenny McIntosh, who's one of the founders, he also does these Q&As with wrestling legends. So I'm traveling around the UK with that unit and we're talking about a lot of things. So we were talking about what you would watch again. And, people would watch the cinematic matches again because they stand up, and Stadium Stampede stands up. But I personally, it's too early for me to watch WrestleMania 36 again to see, Drew McIntyre win the championship in an empty performance center. And in the book, I didn't do the interview, but I quote him as saying that because it was taped, he wasn't sure if he really was the champion because it hadn't aired yet. And he had to wait until it aired on TV before he took the championship out. And, I still think I would get bummed out watching that moment, in an empty arena. 10 years from now, maybe we'll be watching it and talking about it. And, it won't feel like as much of a bummer, but it still feels like a bummer.
I agree. I mean, after reading Drew's book and thinking about him being champion during this time, and I said this, I'm pretty sure I said this on the podcast. We talked about Drew's book. It's like, part of me feels he'll be remembered more for being champion during this time than 2 years before, or
right,
some other random time.
That's a really good point. And but that's with hindsight. It's right. Just like a guy like Glacier is remembered with more fondness today than he was at the time, because at the time he was just kind of a big lug. And nobody said, oh, we'll be talking about Glacier 15 years from now.
Yeah, and everyone's saying, oh, we like Glacier on the internet. That doesn't really up his bank account or, give him something to hold on to at night as much. You want to make the money in your peak. You want to have your peak actually in the ring, not as a fun trivia note 20 years later.
Well, what were you going to say about that, Walt? I saw you made a face.
Well, first off, I hope for Drew McIntyre's sake, I hope no one's comparing him to Glacier per se, but I guess
with all due respect to Glacier.
Oh, of course. We love Glacier.
But I mean, I bring that up though because there were a lot of iconic moments that happened during this time. I mean, we brought up the Stadium Stampede. I mean, the beginning of the Bloodline, which is, this storyline is still happening years
and it's
later.
Great. It's great.
I can talk about a lot of things that have happened since, and it's, we all remember those things, but it's just it's funny looking back at that time, and a lot of what you're seeing in today's product were results of things and decisions that were made in what, we think about it like it's a vacuum, but it's really not. These big decisions were still being made. And
but it's interesting. We talk about the Bloodline. It's like here, Roman Reigns, who, as we know, had just overcome his second bout of leukemia, takes a couple of months off. He's not endangering his health, and he's not endangering. His wife was pregnant with her second set of twins at that point. So he took himself out of the in-ring equation. And as we remember, Roman Reigns was marketed as a white meat babyface, and a lot of fans rebelled against that. And, I quote him in the book. Again, I didn't get that quote as, him saying, the fans are saying, how can Roman Reigns not appear at WrestleMania? He goes, if I was at WrestleMania, they'd be complaining that I was even in WrestleMania. And during that time off, I don't know if the WWE Brain Trust thought about it or Roman Reigns thought about it, but somehow the decision was made when Roman Reigns comes back, he is going to have this edge to him, which every wrestler who's ever known him said they could see backstage. So now you're getting the authentic Roman Reigns. I'm not saying he's that villainous in real life, but he has a certain, even a coolness in his villainy that makes him, which makes fans riveted to everything he does. And did that break of Roman Reigns cause that? We don't know.
Yep. But clearly it happened, and it may you can't discount that COVID and the change in strategy, the change in business certainly played a part in it. But Keith, talking about the other big company and the pandemic and how that affected it, you talk a lot about this in the book. Obviously, AEW was on a huge roll when the pandemic started. They signed a whole bunch of guys that you talk about. It was still fun. Like, we loved seeing the late Brody Lee. We loved seeing Matt Hardy there, at least at the beginning. Like, there was a lot of enthusiasm that still kept up. But I think now that the dust is settled and AEW is still chugging along, they're not hurting necessarily. But to me, it feels like there was some momentum there that they were never fully able to get back. I was curious if you have the same.
I don't know if that has to do with COVID. I think that, what we're talking about might have to do more with being a young company. And look, I was at Grand Slam. So was Walt. I just saw Walt at Grand Slam. I sat with Walt, so I know for a fact that Walt was there. And, there weren't 20,000 fans there this year. There were 12, I think more like 13,000 fans there this year. So, the novelty of the first time of being in New York may have worn off, but those fans who were there were extremely passionate. And I would say every one of those fans will come back. So, there was a honeymoon period. That honeymoon period has passed. The company needs to mature like any company. And, we'll see where it goes. AEW certainly isn't in the throes of death by any means. I mean, unless you guys disagree, and I don't think you do.
No. I just remember them, like you said, novelty is a big part of it, but I just remember the enthusiasm around them being so high, like wanting them to come to your town, wanting to see who they'd sign next, wanting to see, just what they were going to do. And now I think you're right. Now they're just sort of, and maybe it's not COVID related, but they're becoming just a regular company. They're becoming just another player in the wrestling world.
All the flaws that companies have.
Yes, very gaping flaws as we see right now. But not that those can't be taped over.
But that's no different than you get a job in the real world and you're working for a company. And for the first 6 or 9 months, the company can do nothing wrong. And everything that you're enjoying is in comparison to the last company you worked for. And it's so much better here. So with AEW, it's like, this is so much better than WWE. And then at a certain stage, you get disappointed by something, and now you start griping. And I think that's what AEW is going through. You can't say that COVID halted a certain momentum because they couldn't go into markets like New York that had been, or LA, which are traditional WWE markets. But they went in there, and they did go in after COVID, and they did draw, rapturous crowds afterwards. So it's not because of COVID. In fact, maybe that increased the anticipation. Maybe people would have started finding Floyd's in AEW sooner if they'd, blown their wad, so to speak, in those COVID days. But instead, people were still hungry to see them come to their towns.
So we're talking obviously about like the post-COVID era of wrestling. Again, it seems silly to say spoiler alert since this is all very recent events. But getting halfway through the book is there anything the second half or like towards the end of your time chronicling this era of wrestling that you gained any tremendous insight on, anything you can tease for people that haven't read the book yet at all?
What I struggled with is when exactly is the COVID era over? Like, when can I finish this book? Because it kept going on. And, early 2021, and I realized, as I said at the beginning, I'm juxtaposing real life with wrestling. So January 2021 started. I was hoping by 2021, the COVID era would be over. People would be safe again. The virus would have evaporated and there'd be full crowds again. And we weren't quite there. And I thought, okay, like the first Wrestle Kingdom after the pandemic was held. And, it was only a couple of thousand fans because they were practicing social distancing in Japan. And still, the fans were not allowed to cheer because there was a fear in Japan that could spread bacteria. So they could clap, but they couldn't cheer. So this is not normal. We're not back to normal yet. And then the day after Wrestle Kingdom in America, January 6th happens. And, I'm watching wrestling and I'm watching real life. And I'm like, this book isn't over. I have to keep going for a while because I can't say. And then there was an insurrection in the Capitol. And, and
anyway, Dynamite.
The end, right? So I went a few more months. No, I went until January 2022. The beginning of the book is technically January 1st, 2020, and I go till January 1st, 2022. WWE holds its New Year's Day event, and Roman Reigns gets sick after he's come back. Of course, now everyone's vaccinated, or most people are vaccinated. So as a result of that, Roman Reigns isn't on a ventilator. Roman Reigns' leukemia doesn't come back. Roman Reigns' babies are protected. And although they're not vaccinated, but he knows how to isolate. And WWE, very quickly, they improvise and they have Brock emerge with the title from the main event. They turn a 4-way into a 5-way. But the road to WrestleMania continues. And that's basically how this book ends. It's like, okay, we're going to have COVID, we're going to have wrestling, and the two are going, we're going to have to reconcile all of that because both will always be here.
Yeah, it's not a clean ending, like you said. I'm sure you're hoping for, and then everybody lived their lives the way they did 3 years ago, and we could all. But that's not the world we live in. And I think the one thing I really love about this book so far is you like Walt said, you show resilience, you adapt on the fly. You clearly were the goalposts were constantly changing day by day, and you were there chronicling it all and then putting it into this tome. And I think that's just like Walt said, it harkens back. It wasn't the best time for most of us, but it's still good to remember it. It's good to recall it. It's good to see how it sort of shaped the landscape that now we currently live in.
Yeah, and it's nice that, we're not in that lockdown state right now, except for my sister who still doesn't take off her mask or eat in a restaurant, but that's her business. Everyone's allowed to live how they want. Now, look, I just traveled to the UK. Maybe it's foolhardy. No one else was wearing a mask on the flight. I didn't wear a mask on the flight. I was at 2 wrestling-related events. No one was wearing masks. I'm assuming, I know everyone in my friend group over here in the UK is vaccinated. So maybe I'm going on the assumption that most people are. Our friend Patrick, Jean-Joseph, who, Walt and I just saw at Grand Slam, he had COVID last week. He's texting us and making wrestling observations, so I assume it didn't kill him. And so there is a level of normalcy. Like you can have the flu for a few days and then you go back to work. And it seems that's where we are now. So when you're looking back at also how much we didn't know before the vaccine, I was at the GCW show in Indianapolis in the summer of 2020, and Ricky Shane Page was walking around the dressing room with a thermometer, a digital thermometer, and taking people's temperature. So that's how they were trying to be safe. And it's a window into how in the recent past we knew so much less than we know now, and there's still a lot we don't know. In fact, according to a guy I saw in a bar in Queens where I grew up not long ago, do you know that you can get pancreatic cancer from the vaccine? I didn't know that.
Wow.
But he does.
Learn something new. I was going to say, when you said a guy in a bar, I was waiting to hear what the rest of that was going to be. I knew it was going to be insightful and I'm sure scientific and all that. Well, Keith, like you said, pro wrestling is back. It's been around the whole time, but the normalcy has returned to a certain extent. And if we want to dip back and to see how we got to this point, your book is a great way to do that. We're going to be talking about it again when we're both done and review it full on the show. But we wanted to have you on and pitch it and sell it to the people. You're our best friend on the show, and we love your work. And we are very excited to talk to you here. And Follow the Buzzards is out now. Read it and review on Amazon so Keith doesn't have 2 stars on his great book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. Well, so great to talk to Keith as usual. Like we said, 5 times, unprecedented. I don't know if anyone will ever catch up to him by the end of this show, but it's because he's the best. He's your friend in real life. He's our friend in real life, and he's just a wonderful friend of the show. And I love talking about his whole process of putting these books together.
Friend of the show, friend of the life. Yeah, I'm excited for him to get back so we can sit and watch Dynamite together or something.
As we said at the end, that's the joy of where we are right now, is we can gather in bars, in venues, and watch wrestling again, as opposed to getting drunk and watching it on Zoom, as Keith talks about.
Or house party, I think you quoted, which I took me a second. I'm like, what is that again? Oh,
yeah, it was like a house party. I forget. That whole era is so blacked out for many reasons. So it's good I'm glad we don't remember what the hell that is. But it was great to talk to Keith regardless. Love his books. And like we said, we're going to cover Follow the Buzzards in full very soon on the show. So keep track of the show, read the book, and come back to us in a future episode. And we'll be breaking it down in detail. And of course, you can also find our other episodes at awesometruth.libsyn.com. Subscribe to us everywhere podcasts are delivered. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher in particular, we are there. And follow us on Twitter and Instagram at awesometruthpod. Well, again, great to have this conversation, and enjoy the rest of Follow the Buzzards, and we'll be looping back to it real soon.
Yeah, I mean, if you stack all of our Keith content in the one super podcast, that might take you 6 hours. So. I highly suggest you do that.
That's right. Go back and listen to Keith and read his book, and we'll be back to you soon. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, the truth will set you free.